During the 19th century in the United States, the women's suffrage movement lasted through 1848-1917 and pushed the boundaries of their time, which prompted women to fight for the right to vote. At the start of the first suffrage movement, women in the United States didn't have many rights or power, and it had been that way for a long time since it was assumed that men would take care of all of their needs. Once women married, they were entirely dependent on their husbands and weren't encouraged to pursue education. Instead, they were expected to marry, take care of their children, husbands, and households. When married, women couldn't own property. They had to give any money they made over to their husbands and also weren't allowed to vote. But through their rigorous and constant attempts, they changed the future and the future of women to come. The first suffrage movement was made in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the leader of the women's rights movement, along with Lucretia Mott, an American social reformer who founded the organized women's rights movement, was also part of the Quaker movement who directed the convention with Stanton. At the convention, Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments, a statement of grievances and demands patterned closely after the Declaration of Independence, and called for women to organize and petition for their rights. Women wanted to be treated as individuals, not dependents of men. They wanted more employment and education opportunities. They wanted the option to run for office, speak in front of Congress, and vote. But it subjected the Seneca Falls Convention to subsequent ridicule and caused many to withdraw their support, but also gained them support from those who agreed with them. And in the crowd a man stood, getting the attention of everyone, a former slave, an abolitionist, and orator. His name was Frederick Douglass, and he said,
"All that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of woman. And if that government only is just which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying to woman the exercise of the elective franchise. Our doctrine is that right is of no sex."
In 1869, a new group called the National Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Lucy Stone, began to fight for a universal suffrage amendment to the United States Constitution. During the 1850s, the women's rights movement gathered momentum, but lost it when the Civil War began in 1861. Almost immediately after the war ended, the 14th and 15th Amendment to the Constitution raised familiar questions of suffrage and citizenship. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, extends the Constitution's protection to all citizens and defines citizens as male. The 15th, ratified in 1817, guarantees black men the right to vote. Some women's suffrage advocates believe that this was their chance for universal suffrage, and that was when the Second National Suffrage Association was created. It was called the American Women's Suffrage Association, or the AWSA, founded in 1869 by Lucy Stone. The AWSA supported the 15th Amendment, protested the confrontational tactics of the NWSA, and concentrated on gaining women's access to polls at state and local levels in the belief that victories would gradually build support for national action on the issue. By then, the suffragist approach had changed. Instead of arguing that women deserve the same rights and responsibilities as men because men and women were created equal, the new generation of activists argued that women deserve the vote because they were different from men. In 1890, the NWSA and the AWSA merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association, otherwise known as the NAWSA. It became the largest women's suffrage organization in the country and led much of the struggle for the vote. At the time, a growing number of black women actively supported the women's suffrage during this period. Prominent African American suffragists such as Ida B. Wells led a crusade against lynching and took part as the sole black woman in the Illinois delegation in the first suffrage parade at Washington, D.C. in 1913, which was organized by the NAWSA. In 1916, the AWSA became the NWP, the National Women's Party, founded by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The NWP employed more militant tactics to agitate for the vote, such as silent protests, hunger strikes, and holding up banners of taunting remarks. Along with the movements came protests and petitions outside in the streets, which caused violence to ensue. Most notably, the NWP organized the first White House picket in U.S. history in January 1917. They stood in silence at the White House for 6 days a week, nearly for 3 years. The Silent Sentinels, they were called, They held up their banners comparing the president, Woodrow Wilson, to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Many of the Sentinels were arrested and jailed in deplorable conditions. Some incarcerated women went on hunger strikes and endured forced feedings. The Sentinels' treatment gained greater sympathy for women's suffrage, and the courts later dismissed all charges against them, embarrassing President Wilson into reversing his opposition and supporting a federal women's suffrage amendment. When New York adopted women's suffrage in 1917 and President Wilson supported the 19th Amendment in 1918, did the political balance begin to shift in favor of the vote for women. But there was still strong opposition to enfranchising women by petitions from anti-suffrage groups. Eventually, suffragists won the political support necessary for ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and in 1919 it went to the states for ratification. In May, the House of Representatives passed it by a vote of 304 to 90. 2 weeks later, the Senate approved it 56 to 25. Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan were the first states to ratify it. In August of 1920, Tennessee had ratified the amendment as the result of a change of vote by 24-year-old legislator Harry Byrne at the insistence of his elderly mother. But those against the amendment managed to delay the official ratification by fleeing the state to avoid a quorum, held massive anti-suffrage rallies, and attempted to convince pro-suffrage legislators to oppose ratification. Tennessee delivered the crucial 36th ratification necessary for final adoption, enfranchising all American women and declaring for the first time that they, like men, deserved all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. The face of the American electorate had changed forever, and it was the women along with the help of men that changed their future and the future of women to come.